Right, shalom everyone. I wanted to get right into the next video in the series of going through this book entitled Translators Revived by Alexander McClure. We've already read the foreword, the preface, and the introductory narrative. And so the next one on the list is the Translators Revived. And I'm going to try not to have these videos go longer than 45 minutes max. I want to try to keep it right at about 30 minutes. Okay, and I do have a playlist that this is where all of these videos on this book is going to be contained in, okay? Okay, so having thus traced the history of our common version through the successive steps by which it has come down to us in its present shape, it remains for us to inquire as to the persons who put the finishing hand to the work, and to satisfy ourselves as to their qualifications for the task. It is obvious that this personal investigation is of the utmost importance in settling the degree of confidence to which their labors are entitled. Unless it can be proved that they were, as a body, eminently fitted to do this work as it ought to be done, it can have no claim to be regarded as a finality in the matter of furnishing a translation of the Word of God for the English-speaking populations of the globe. It is exceedingly strange that a question of such obvious importance has been so long left almost unnoticed. Numerous histories of the translation itself have been drawn up with great labor, but no man seems to have thought it worth his while to give any account of the translators except the most meager notices of a few of them and general attestations to their reputation in their own time for such scholarship and skill as their undertaking required. Even the late excellent Christopher Anderson, in his huge volumes, replete as they are with research and information upon the minutest points relating to the subject, allots but a page or two of his smaller type to this essential branch of it. It is nearly 20 years since the writer of these pages began to consider the desirableness of knowing more of these eminent divines, and he has ever since pursued a zealous search wherever he was likely to effect any restitution of decayed intelligence respecting them. At first he almost despaired of ascertaining much more than the bare names of most of them, but by degrees he has collected innumerable scraps of information gathered from a great variety of sources, amply sufficient with due arrangement to illustrate the subject. His object is simply to show that the translators commissioned by James Stewart were ripe and critical scholars, profoundly versed in all the learning required, and that in these particulars there has never yet been a time when a better qualified company could have been collected for the purpose. Of the 47 who acted under King James' commission, some are almost unknown at this day, though of high repute in their own time. A few have left us but little more than their names, worthy of immortal remembrance, were it only for their connection with this noble monument of learning and piety. But their being associated with so many other scholars and divines of the greatest eminence is proof that they were deemed to be fit companions for the brightest lights of the land. This is confirmed by the fact that, though the king designed to employ in this work the highest and ripest talents in his realm, there were still many men in England distinguished for their learning, like Broughton and Bedell, who were not enrolled on the list of translators. It is but just to conclude, therefore, that even such as are now less known to us were then accounted to deserve a place with the best. What we may know of the greater part of them must lead to the highest estimate of the whole body of these good men. The catalogue brings with one whose name is worthy of the place it fills. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is Lancelot Andrewes. He was born at London in 1565. He was trained chiefly at Merchant Taylor's School in his native city till he was appointed to one of the first Greek scholarships at Pembroke Hall in the University of Cambridge. Once a year at Easter, he used to pass a month with his parents. During this vacation, he would find a master from whom he learned some language to which he was before a stranger. In this way, after a few years, he acquired most of the modern languages of Europe. At the university, he gave himself chiefly to the Oriental tongues and to divinity. When he became candidate for a fellowship, there was but one vacancy, and he had a powerful competitor in Dr. Dove, who was afterwards Bishop of Peterborough. After long and severe examination, the matter was decided in favor of Andrews. But Dove, though vanquished, proved himself in this trail so fine a scholar that the college, unwilling to lose him, appointed him as a sort of supernumeracy fellow. Andrews also received a complimentary appointment as Fellow of Jesus College in the University of Oxford. In his own college, he was made a catecherist, that is to say, a lecturer in divinity. His conspicuous talent soon gained him powerful patrons. Henry, Earl of Huntingdon, took him into the north of England, where he was the means of converting many papists by his preaching and disputations. He was also warmly befriended by Sir Francis Walsingham, Secretary of State to Queen Elizabeth. He was made Parson of Alton in Hampshire, and then Vicar of St. Giles in London. He was afterwards made prebendary and canon residentiary of St. Paul's and also of the Collegate Church of Southwark. He lectured on divinity at St. Paul's 3 times each week. On the death of Dr. Falk in 1589, Dr. Andrews, though so young, was chosen master of Pembroke Hall, where he had received his education. While at the head of this college, he was one of its principal benefactors. It was rather poor at that time, but by his efforts, its endowments were much increased, and at his death many years later, he bequeathed to it, besides some plate, 300 folio volumes and £1,000 to found 2 fellowships. He gave up his mastership to become chaplain in ordinary to Queen Elizabeth, who delighted in his preaching and made him prebendary of Westminster and afterwards dean of that famous church. In the matter of church dignities and preferments, he was highly favored. It was while he held the office of Dean of Westminster that Dr. Andrews was made director or president of the first company of Translators, composed of 10 members who held their meetings at Westminster. The portion assigned to them was the 5 books of Moses and the historical books to the end of the 2nd book of Kings. Perhaps no part of the work is better executed than this. With King James, Dr. Andrews still stood in high favor than he had done with Elizabeth. The Royal Pendant had published a defense of the rights of kings in opposition to the arrogant claims of the popes. He was answered most bitterly by the celebrated Cardinal Bellarmine. The king set Dr. Andrews to refute the cardinal, which he did in a learned and spirited quarto, highly commended by Casaubon. To that quarto the cardinal made no reply. For this service the king rewarded his champion by making him Bishop of Chester, to which office Dr. Andrews was consecrated November 3rd, 1605. This was soon after his appointment to be one of the translators of the Bible. He accepted the bishopric with great humility, having already refused that dignity more than once. The motto graven on his episcopal seal was the solemn exclamation, "And who is sufficient for these things?" At this time, He was also made Lord Almoner to the king, a place of great trust in which he proved himself faithful and uncorrupt. In September 1609, he was transferred to the bishopric of Ely and was called to His Majesty's Privy Council. In February of 1618, he was translated to the bishopric of Westminster, which, if less dignified that the archiepiscopal see of Canterbury, was then much more richly endowed, so that it used to be said, Canterbury is the higher rack, but Westminster is the better manager. At the time of this last preferment, Dr. Andrews was appointed Dean of the King's Chapel, and these stations he retained until his death. In the high offices Bishop Andrews filled, he conducted himself with great ability and integrity. The crack-brained king, who scarce knew now to restrain his profaneness and levity under the most serious circumstances, was overawed by the gravity of this prelate and desisted from mirth, from frivolity in his presence. The bishop knew how to be facetious on occasion. Edmund Waller, the poet, tells of being once at court and overhearing a conversation held by the king with Bishop Andrews and Bishop Neil of Durham. The monarch, who was always a jealous stickler for his prerogatives and something more, was in those days trying to raise a revenue without parliamentary authority. In these measures, so clearly unconstitutional, he was opposed by Bishop Andrews with dignity and decision. Waller says, the king asked this brace of bishops, my lords, cannot I make my subjects money when I want it, without all this formality in Parliament? The Bishop of Durham, one of the meanest of sycophants to his prince, and a harsh and haughty oppressor of his Puritan clergy, made ready answer, God forbid, sir, but you should. You are the breath of our nostrils. Upon this the king looked at the Bishop of Winchester. Well, my lord, what say you? Dr. Andrews replied evasively, sir, I have no skill to judge of parliamentary matters. But the king persisted. No put-offs, my lord, answer me presently. Then, sir, said the shrewd bishop, I think it lawful for you to take my brother Neil's money, for he offers it. Okay, well, even the king was hugely pleased with this piece of pleasantry, which gave great amusement to his cringing courtiers. For the benefit of the afflicted, as the advertisements have it, we give a little incident which may afford a useful hint to some that need it. While Dr. Andrews was one of the divines at Cambridge, he was applied to by a worthy alderman of that drowsy city, who was beset by the sorry habit of sleeping under the afternoon sermon, and who, to his great mortification, had been publicly rebuked by the minister of the parish. As snuff had not then came into vogue, Dr. Andrews did not advise, as some matter-of-fact persons have done in such cases, to titillate the sneezer with a rousing pinch. He seems to have been of the opinion of the famous Dr. Romaine, who once told his full-fed congregation in London that it was hard work to preach to 2 pounds of beef and a pot of porter. So Dr. Andrews advised his civic friend to help his wakefulness by dining very sparingly. The advice was followed, but without avail. Again, the rotund dignitary slumbered and slept in his pew, and again was he roused by the harsh rebukes of the irritated preacher. With tears in those 2 sleepy eyes of his, the mortified alderman repaired to Dr. Andrews, begging for further counsel. The considerate divine, pitying his infirmity, recommended to him to dine as usual, and then to take his nap before repairing to his pew. This plan was adopted into the next discourse, which was a violent invective prepared for the very purpose of castigating the alderman's solemn habit. He listened with unwinking eyes, and his uncommon vigilance gave quite a ridiculous air to the whole business. The unhappy parson was nearly as much vexed at his huge-waisted parishioners' unwonted wakefulness as before at his unseemly dozing. Bishop Andrews continued in high esteem with Charles I, and that most culpable of monarchs, whose only redeeming quality was the strength and tenderness of his domestic affections, in his dying advice to his children, advising them to study the writings of 3 divines, of whom our translator was one. Lancelot Andrews died at Winchester House in Southwark, London, September 25, 1626, aged 61 years. He was buried in the Church of St. Saviour, where a fair monument marks the spot. Having never married, he bequeathed his property to benevolent uses. John Milton, then but a youth, wrote a glowing Latin elegy on his death. As a preacher, Bishop Andrews was right famous in his day. He was called Star of Preachers. Thomas Fuller says that he was an intimidable preacher in his way, and such plagiarists as have stolen his sermons could never steal his preaching, and could make nothing of that, whereof he made all things as he desired. Pious and pleasant Bishop Felton, his contemporary and colleague, endeavored in vain in his sermons to assimilate to his style, and therefore said merrily of himself, I had almost marred my own natural trot by endeavoring to intimidate his artificial amble. Let this be a warning to all who would fain play the monkey, and especially to such as would ape the eccentricities of genius, nor is it desirable that Bishop Andrews' style should be imitated even successfully, for it abounds in quips, quirks, and puns according to the false taste of his time. Few writers are so happy as to treat on matters which must always interest, and to do it in a manner which shall forever please. To build up a solid literary reputation, taste, and judgment in composition are as necessary as learning and strength of thought. The once admired folios of Bishop Andrews have long been doomed to the dusty dignities of the lower shelf in the library. Many hours he spent there each day in private and family devotions, and there were some who used to desire that they might end their days in Bishop Andrews' chapel. He was one in whom was proved the truth of Luther's saying that to have prayed well is to have studied well. His manual for his private devotions, prepared by himself, is wholly in the Greek language. It has been translated and printed. This praying prelate also abounded in almsgiving, usually sending his benefactions in private, as from a friend who chose to remain unknown. He was exceedingly liberal in his gifts to poor and deserving scholars. His own instructors he held in the highest reverence. His old schoolmaster, Mulcaster, always sat at the upper end of the episcopal table, and when the venerable pedagogue was dead, his portrait was placed over the bishop's study door. These were just tokens of respect. For if the scholar to such height did reach, then what was he who did that scholar teach? This worthy diocesan was much given to hospitality, and especially to literary strangers. So bountiful was his cheer that it used to be said, my Lord of Winchester keeps Christmas all year round. He once spent £3,000 in 3 days, though in this we praise him not, in entertaining King James at Farnham Castle. His society was as much sought, however, for the charm of his rich instructive conversation as for his liberal housekeeping and his exalted station. But we are chiefly concerned to know what were his qualifications as a translator of the Bible. He ever bore the character of a right godly man and a prodigious student. One competent judge speaks of him as that great gulf of learning. It was also said that the world wanted learning to know how learned this man was. And a brave old chronicler remarks that such was his skill in all languages, especially the Oriental, that had he been present at the confusion of tongues at Babel, he might have served as interpreter general. In his funeral sermon by Dr. Buckeridge, Bishop of Rochester, it is said that Dr. Andrews was conversant with 15 languages. Okay. This one is John Overall. This divine is the next on the list of 3 good men, of whom the marginal comment in the Popish translation says, they will be abhorred in the depths of hell. They may be abhorred there, but after a while, nowhere else. He was born in 1559 at Hadley and was bred in the free school at that place. He lived through the whole of that happy period, which many besides the old bard of Rydal Mont regarded as the best days of old England, when faith and hope were in their prime in great Eliza's golden time. In due season he was entered as a scholar at St. John's College, Cambridge. He was next chosen Fellow of Trinity College in the same university in 1596. He was made King's Professor of Divinity and at the same time took his doctor's degree, being about 37 years of age. It is noted of this eminent theologian by Bishop Hackett that it was his custom to ground his thesis in the schools on 2 or 3 texts of Scripture, showing what latitude of opinion or interpretation was admissible upon the point in hand. He was celebrated for the appropriateness of his quotations from the Fathers. He was soon after made master of Catherine Hall, very much against his will. To end a bitter contention in regard to 2 rival candidates, he was elected. If election it could be called, under the Queen's absolute mandate, when Archbishop Whitgift wished the new master joy of his place, the latter replied that it was terminus dominius, which is Latin for an Irish promotion or a hoist downhill. But his grace, in the true spirit of a courtier of all of the olden time, told the dissatisfied professor that if the injuries, much more the less courtesies of princes must be thankfully taken, as the ushers to make way for greater favors, these appointments must be taken as full proof of Dr. Overall's superior scholarship in that learned age, when such preferments were only won by dint of the severest application to study. In 1601, on the recommendation of Lord Brooke, that noble friend and patron of men and learning and genius, Dr. Overall was made Dean of St. Paul's in London. It may be doubted whether this studious recluse, absorbed in deep studies, shone with his brightest luster in the pulpit. Being appointed, says Thomas Fuller, to preach before the Queen, he professed to my father, who was most intimate with him, that he had spoken Latin so long it was troublesome to him to speak English in a continued oration. Soon after, the throne was filled by James I, whom that accomplished statesman, the Duke of Sully, called the most learned fool in Europe. The convocation or parliament of the clergy came together. Dr. Overall was I can't pronounce that word, or speaker of the lower house of convocation. To this body he presented a volume of canons, the only book from his pen now extant. its object was to vindicate the divine right of government. But though it was adopted by the convocation, the king prevented the publication of the book at that time, because it taught that when, after a revolution or conquest, a new government or dynasty was firmly established, this also in its turn could plead for itself a divine right and could claim the obedience of the people as a matter of duty toward God. This convocation book, now so long forgotten, was printed many years after the death of King Jimmy and obtained some historical and political celebrity because it had the very effect which was apprehended by the monarch who suppressed it. For when his grandson, James II, was expelled from the soil and throne of England, many bishops and other clergymen called non-jurors refused through conscientious scruples to swear allegiance to the new government of William and Mary. Bishop Sherlock and many others who at first declined the oath professed to be converted from that error by the reading of Dr. Overall's book, but conversions so favorable to thrift are apt to be held in suspicion. Dr. Overall was the author of the questions and answers relating to the sacraments, which have been much admired by the ablest judges of such matters, and which were subjoined to the Catechism of the Church of England in the first year of James I. It was while he was Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral that he was joined in the commission, the highest of his honors, for translating the Bible. Though long familiarity with other languages may have made him somewhat inapt for continuous public discourse in his mother tongue, he was thereby the better fitted to discern the sense of the sacred original. He was styled by Camden a prodigious learned man, and is said by Fuller to have been of a strong brain to improve his great reading. John Overall, who carried superintendency in his surname, was made Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry in 1614. 4 years later, he was transferred to the See of Norwich, where in a few months he died at the age of 60 years. This was in 1619. He frequently had in his mouth the words of the psalmist, "When thou with rebukes dost correct man for iniquity, thou makest his beauty to consume away like a moth. Surely every man is vanity." In his later years, he was unhappily inclined to Arminianism. He was a correspondent of Vossius and Grotius and other famous scholars on the continent. He was greatly addicted to the scholastic theology now so much decried. Since the days of Bacon, the schoolmen have been much more depreciated because there was so little practical fruit of their studies. And yet there was something wonderful in the keenness and subtlety of their disputes, though it is lawful to smile at the excess of logical refinement which subdivided the stream of their genius into a ramification of rills, absorbed at last in the dry desert of metaphysics. One of them is highly praised by Cardan, for that only one of his arguments was enough to puzzle all posterity, and that when he was grown old, he wept because he could not understand his own books. We can conceive, however, that the refinement of the schoolmen as to precise definitions and nicer shades of thought might be a valuable quality in some, at least, of the company of translators. Okay, and I think I've got time to read one more. Okay, I'm not sure if this is Hadrian or Hadrian Saravia, possibly. This noted scholar was a Belgian by birth. His father was a Spaniard, his mother was a Belgian, and both were Protestants. He was born in 1530 at Hedin in Artos. Of his early life, no notices have reached us. He was for some years a pastor both in Flanders and Holland. He was in his principles a terrible high churchman, and seems from his zeal for the divine right of episcopacy to have had some trouble with his colleagues and the magistrates at Ghent, where he was one of the ministers in 1566. From that place he retired to England. He was sent by Queen Elizabeth's council to a sort of missionary to the islands of Gunnersea and Jersey, where he was one of the first Protestant ministers, knowing, as he says of himself in a letter, which were the beginnings, and by which means and occasions the preaching of God's word was planted there. He labored there a twofold capacity, doing the work of an evangelist and conducting a newly established school called Elizabeth College. From his island home, he was recalled to the continent by the Belgian churches in 1577. He was invited to become professor of divinity at the University of Leiden in 1582, and soon after was also made preacher of the French church in that city. In 1587, he came to England with the Earl of Leicester and became master of the grammar school in Southampton, where in the course of a few years he trained many distinguished pupils. His zeal for episcopacy led him to publish several Latin treatises against Beza, Dontius, and other Presbyterians. He also published a treatise on papal primacy against the Jesuit Grester. All his publications relate to such matters and were collected into a folio edition in the year 1611. They are still highly praised by the Oxford divines, who have given occasion to Macaulay to say in his caustic style, the glory of being further behind the age than any other class of the British people is one which learned that body acquired early and has never lost. In 1590, Saravia was made Doctor of Divinity at Oxford and had been done long before at the University of Leiden. He was made Predinitary of Gloucester next to Canterbury in 1695, and then of Westminster in 1601. This last was his highest preferment. He added to it the rectorship of Great Chart in Kent some 8 years after. He died at Canterbury, January 15th, 1612, aged 82 years. Thus, his fluctuating life ended in a quiet old age and a peaceful death. He is said by Anthony a Wood to have been educated in all kinds of literature in his younger days, especially in several languages. It was his fortune to find friends and patrons among the great. Archbishop Whitgift, that stern suppressor of Puritanism, held him in high esteem and made great use of his aid in conducting his share in the controversies of the time. In particular, the archprelate relied much on Dr. Saravia's Hebrew learning in his contest with Hugh Brighton, that stiff Puritan, whom Lightfoot styles the great Albanian divine, renowned in many nations for rare skill in Salem's and Athens tongues, and familiar acquaintance with all rabbinical learning. Thus the Predinitary of Westminster was accustomed to cross swords with no mean adversaries, and was no doubt thoroughly furnished with the knowledge necessary for a Bible translator. While Dr. Saravia was Prebendary of Canterbury, the famous Richard Hooker was parson of the village of Bourne, about 3 miles distant. Between these worthies there sprang up a friendship, cemented by the agreement of their views and studies. Keble says that Saravia was Hooker's confidential advisor, while the latter was preparing his celebrated books of the law of ecclesiastical polity. Old Isaac Walton gives the following beautiful picture of their Christian intimacy. These two excellent persons began a holy friendship, increasing daily to so high and mutual affections that their two wills seemed to be but one and the same, and their designs both for the glory of God and peace of the church, still assisting and improving each other's virtues and the desired comforts of a peaceable piety. This is very short on Richard Clark. Dr. Clark is spoken of as a fellow of Christ College, Cambridge, and as a very learned clergyman and eminent preacher. He was vicar of Minster and Monkton in Thanet, and one of the 6 preachers of the Cathedral Church in Canterbury. He died in 1634. 3 years after his death, a folio volume of his learned sermons was published, but alas for folios and learned sermons in these days. When people look on such a thing, they are ready to exclaim, like Robert Hall, at the sight of Dr. Gill's voluminous commentary, "What a continent of mud." Okay, so, they even said, there was a few that, with as much, digging and trying to get as much information, a few, they just didn't, have very much information to go by. John Layfield. Dr. Layfield was Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and Rector of the Church of St. Clement's Danes in London. Of him it is said that, being skilled in architecture, his judgment was much relied on for the fabric of the tabernacle and temple. He died at his rectory in 1617. Few things are more difficult than the giving of architectural details in such a manner as to be intelligible to the unprofessional reader. Hi. This name in all the printed lists of the translators has been misspelled Lee. It should be Teigh or Tighe. Dr. Tighe was born at Deepening, Lincolnshire, and was educated partly at Oxford and partly at Cambridge. He was Archdeacon of Middlesex and Vicar of the Church of All Hallows, Barking, London. He is characterized as an excellent textuary and profound linguist. Dr. Tighe died in 1620, leaving to his son an estate of £1,000 a year, which is worth mentioning because so rarely done by men of the clerical profession. Okay, and then you can see this as well. This is Burleigh. Dr. Burleigh was made Vicar of Bishop Stotford in 1590, which benefice he held at the time of his appointment to the important service of this Bible translation. Geoffrey King. Mr. King was Fellow of King's College, Cambridge. It is a fair token of his fitness to take part in this translation work that he succeeded Mr. Spalding, another of these translators, as Regius Professor of Hebrew in that university. Men were not appointed in those days to such duties of instruction with the expectation that they would qualify themselves after their introduction into office. The late Professor Stewart was wont to say that when he was appointed Hebrew professor at Andover, all he knew of the language was that this means blessed, and high-ish means the man, from Psalms 1:1. Okay, Richard Thompson. Mr. Thompson, at the time of his appointment, was Fellow of Clark Hall, Cambridge. According to Wood, he was a Dutchman born of English parents. By the Presbyterian divines, he was called the Grand Propagator of Arminianism. Of the Prelatic Arminians, Coleridge truly said that they emptied revelation of all the doctrines that can properly be said to have been revealed. If sin be the greatest heresy, as that class usually affirms a more serious error imputed to Mr. Thompson is intemperance in his later years. As to his literary qualifications, he is described by the learned Richard Montgoose as a most admirable philosopher who was better known in Italy, France, and Germany than at home. A bit more here on William Bedwell. Mr. Bedwell was educated at St. John's College, Cambridge. He was vicar of Tottenham High Cross near London. He died at his vicarage at the age of 70, May 5th, 1632, justly reputed to have been an eminent Oriental scholar. He published in quarto an edition of the Epistles of St. John's in Arabic with a Latin version, printed at the press of at Antwerp in 1612. Many Arabic manuscripts to the University of Cambridge with numerous notes upon them and with a font of types for printing them. His fame for Arabic learning was so great that when Urpinius was a most renowned Orientalist, resided in England in 1606, he was much indebted to Bedwell for direction in his studies. To Bedwell, rather than to Urpinius, who commonly enjoys it, belongs the honor of being the first who considerably promoted and revived the study of the Arabic language and literature in Europe. He was also tutor to another Orientalist of renown, Dr. Pocock. For many years, Mr. Bedwell was engaged in preparing an Arabic lexicon in 3 volumes and went to Holland to examine the collections of Joseph Scaliger, but proceeding very slowly from desire to make his work as perfect as possible, Golius forestalled him by the publication of a similar work. After Bedwell's death, the voluminous manuscripts of his lexicon were loaned by the University of Cambridge to aid in the compilation of Dr. Castell's colossal work, the Lexicon Heptaglotton. Some modern scholars have fancied that we have an advantage in our times over the translators of King James' day by reason of the greater attention which is supposed to be paid at present to what are called the cognate and Semitic languages, and especially the Arabic, by which much light is thought to be reflected upon Hebrew words and phrases. It is evident, however, that Mr. Bedwell and others among his fellow laborers were thoroughly conversant in this part of the broad field of sacred criticism. Mr. Bedwell also commenced a Persian dictionary, which is among Archbishop Laud's manuscripts still preserved in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. In 1615, he published his book, A Discovery of the Impostures of Mahomet and of the Quran. To this was annexed his Arabian Trudgeman. Trudgeman or Trukman is the word dragoman in its older form and is derived from a Chaldee word meaning interpreter. This Arabian Trudgeman is a most curious illustration of Oriental etymology and history. Dr. Bedwell had a fondness for mathematical studies. He invented a ruler for geometrical purposes, like what we call Gunter's scale, which went by the name of Bedwell's ruler. He is spoken of in his as being for the Eastern tongues as learned a man as most lived in those modern times. Okay, so we'll go ahead. I'll read this, and then we will go ahead and close out, because this is the close of the first group. This closes what we have to say of that first Westminster Company of 10 members to whom was committed the historical books, beginning with Genesis and ending with the second book of Kings, once commonly called, as its title still says, the fourth book of the Kings. The second company of King James Translators held its meetings in Cambridge. To this section of those learned divines was assigned from the beginning of Chronicles to the end of Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. The 8 men to whom this important part of the work was assigned was no whit behind their associates in fitness for their great undertaking. Okay, so that's where we will start in the next, and we'll try to go through the second group. I think, you know, and unless each man's page is like really, really long, we should be able to get through the second. So, all right, guys, I will go ahead and close out, and I will just bid you all blessings and shalom until the next video. All right, guys, shalom.